And while I get set up, I'll just say that I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And so I have to say it because otherwise people miss the first part of my talk trying to guess where I'm from. So now that you know I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, the mystery's solved. There's no need to get distracted. Yeah. And so what I'm going to be talking about is actually give two examples of how I applied my approach in the context of education, because those are published papers. But what I'm really excited about is using this dynamic approach in apps for health behavior change. So I'm speaking now with Zhao and Ming and others of how we can use this for helping people to exercise more. And we've worked also on mental health. So if people here have ideas for settings they think they'd like to run these kinds of A/B tests, we also have a back-end web service that lets you plug machine learning into A/B testing more generally. And there are actually several people here like Radhika and Sam Cox who are grad students and interns working on this. Great. So as I mentioned, where's the best way to stand? Okay, right there. So as I mentioned, what I'm focusing on is thinking, how can we use randomized experiments or A/B testing to enhance systems for health behavior change or learning by bringing together crowdsourcing and personalization in a way that's driven by both theories from psychology and machine learning? So I think some of the challenges that I'm especially excited about are how do we help people's mental and physical health? And one thing I've worked on has been actually online cognitive behavior therapy, which is so effective that in the UK, doctors can actually write a prescription for people to do online cognitive behavior therapy, because this has actually been shown to help people with issues like depression. And there's an increasing literature trying to say, how do we apply principles from therapy to handle things like people eating unhealthy, or people actually changing their exercise behavior? Because a lot of the time our health behaviors are driven by our beliefs or our emotions. So if we can empower people to see, well, here's how you ask yourself a question that makes you think twice about eating, or here's just the right nudge to get you to get up and exercise, this could actually have a really big effect. So these are two examples of papers where we try to enhance how people actually applied cognitive behavior therapy in everyday life. And the context there was depression. But what I'm increasingly focusing on, as I mentioned with Diet Lens and Zhao and Ming, is thinking about how do we take components of apps like for exercise and think, well, let's actually redesign these. For example, when someone's reminded to exercise each day, can we design the questions we ask them that actually get them to get up and go? So for example, do you ask someone, what's your plan for exercising today? That could be one condition, versus remember to put aside some time to go and run. So the idea is that we're big believers in, like the recent Nobel Prize in Economics, that small changes in how you nudge people can actually have a really big effect on behavior. So if we can design just the right messages, just the right prompts or questions, we can actually really push people forward. But of course, doing that requires using things like theories from psychology. It requires using the expertise of people who build these apps. But also it might require actually getting users themselves to tell us, well, here's a message I want you to tell me tomorrow. And you can again imagine any piece of the app could be one of these experiments, whether it's questions we ask people or motivational messages and reminders to plan. So I just want you to think about that as what I'm aiming for, because now I'm going to actually present how I've applied these methods in the context of education, where we've again been experimenting with explanations or questions, but in the context of helping people learn. So my approach is at the intersection of human-computer interaction with other areas. So my basic idea is, well, if I want to make something like an app into an intelligent self-improving system, what we need to do is design A/B experiments or components of that. So for example, maybe we want to experiment with what message we send people to get them to exercise. Or we want to experiment with what question we ask someone so that they actually reflect on how they're feeling. For example, what's bothering you today? Or what emotions underlying your behavior? That would be the cognitive behavior therapy angle. So we kind of want to design these A/B experiments. But the way I do that is by drawing on my PhD in cognitive science, as well as work that I did in my postdoc at Stanford, working with actual designers, people like health coaches, doctors who have experience, where we can bring their ideas together with theories from psychology to design, well, what we can experiment on and how we can actually measure if it's helping. But then when we run these experiments, how do we actually put that data into practice to help users? So for example, instead of just running an experiment and then getting some data for a paper, could we actually modify the experiment so that as we see what's working, we can actually roll it out to people? So how would that work? For example, instead of assigning people 50-50 to message 1 versus message 2, you might see that after 100 people got the messages, people were slightly more likely to get up and exercise with message 1. But we're not really sure yet. So the idea is that we actually dynamically analyze it so that we might present message 1 to 60% of people versus 40. Then we get more data. Now it's 80% of people instead of 20. And so over time, this means that every A/B experiment could actually be deployed into a real-world product without even flipping a switch. And this could lead to enhancement, like finding that some messages work well, but it could also lead to personalization, where we might find, for example, that some messages work well for people who really want to be pushed, whereas others need a much more relaxed kind of approach, like asking them, what would get you up and moving? So the kind of key idea is experimentation can be an engine for enhancing and personalizing. So in my PhD, I applied Bayesian statistics and machine learning to modeling cognition, but now I use it to build systems that will actually run these dynamic experiments in real time. So the final component of this, to make an app constantly improve, requires that we don't just have A, B, or C. It actually requires that we keep adding new conditions. Every time someone gets a new idea or there's new data, we can add a new condition and put it in as well. And so this is where actually I draw on methods from crowdsourcing and human computation, where you could have users themselves or designers continually experimenting. So in a way, you just never stop improving. Now, when you actually try to run these A/B tests in the real world, there are a lot of barriers that come up. You can't plug machine learning algorithms in. You can't do crowdsourcing. So what my group has done is actually come up with a software specification, and that's what we call the AdaptComp or Mooklet engine. And this is what we're trying to plug into DietLens. But anyone can use this web service so that they can plug the A/B test in, and then in real time, we can actually do this dynamic personalization. And this is what's been used for these studies I'm presenting now. So that was a lot of run-up, but basically, you kind of see the vision. Let's take any simple A/B test and make it like an intelligent system by dynamically personalizing using machine learning. So I'll give you one example of how we do this in the context of education, where we're actually going to crowdsource explanations from students and then use machine learning to choose the best explanations, which is going to help future students to learn. And then if I have time, I'll give you another example in terms of personalizing motivational emails, which would work well in health behavior context. And of course, I want to leave time for questions so that people can think, well, how would you actually apply these methods to health behavior change? In apps you might be building or in platforms you want to deploy. For example, in teaching people cognitive behavior therapy, in exercise, in health and eating, where, of course, learning and nutrition is really important, or other settings. So you can think of these settings, even though everything I'll talk about now will be education. I think you can see how to make the bridge. So the challenge we're tackling here is that in online courses, people get these problems to solve, but often people don't really learn enough from them. They get the right answer, they get the wrong answer, they get some feedback. What people really need is an explanation for how to solve a problem, so they can see the key idea. In the same way that doctors try to explain to patients why to eat a certain meal, or you might kind of help someone explain why exercising today is going to make them feel better versus just eating those chips or staying in the lab. But we have a problem, right? Where are we going to get all these explanations from? Instructors in online courses, just like doctors, hardly have time to write one explanation. How are they going to write multiple ones to test out? So the idea here is to build on past work of mine from Kai, where we found that actually, if you ask learners to explain, why they think an answer is correct, this can actually help them learn. And you've all seen this before. When you get someone to explain why they want to do something, that's actually a bigger effect than you telling them why. So we wanted to take this together where if we tell learners to explain why an answer is correct, they could come up with new explanations. But then these could actually be A, B, and C conditions to test on future people. And now, are these going to be very good explanations? We're not sure. So this is why we're actually going to use machine learning to dynamically test out which of these explanations actually help people do better. Which do they actually find helpful? So this is work at ACM Learning at Scale. So here's the kind of key setup that you would see if you were a student. you'd see a problem, and then you get the answer. Eventually, you'd either guess and get it wrong, or you'd be told. Well, then we give you an explanation. Here's why the answer is correct. And this is actually what we're going to be experimenting on. So this comes from a current pool, like explanation A or B. We then asked you to give a rating. Well, how helpful was this information for your learning from 0 to 10? So we have some metric of which explanations are good. We then asked, well, to help you learn, why don't you explain in your own words why the answer is correct? So this helps students. It's actually kind of a crowdsourcing that's benefiting them. But you can see that we're being kind of sneaky, right? Because if they give us an explanation and it's above 100 characters and they check a box saying it was useful, well, then we actually add it into our experiment. So we can give this to the very next person. And in Diet we're hoping that we can ask people to suggest what are some messages you want to receive to exercise. And if people suggest messages for themselves, these might actually be working well for other people. So now that we've got this pool of growing explanations, how do we actually test out which ones are working? So in reinforcement learning, sort of sub-area of machine learning on AI, this is considered the exploration-exploitation problem. We're testing out different versions, like assigning 50-50, and we get data. But how do we know when we're sure this one is correct versus we should keep testing out more? So we're going to model this as what's called a multi-armed bandit, which is the kind of simplest form of the exploration-exploitation trade-off. And the key way of this model works is we have a set of actions. In this case, they're different explanations we're presenting. And we have a reward function. This is what we want to optimize. So we want to figure out which explanations will people rate the highest, because we want to give people highly rated explanations as much as possible. We don't want to give them low ones. So what we need now is a policy. For person 1, person 5, person 20, which explanation do we give them at this point in time? And so we use this algorithm called Thompson sampling. It's basically a Bayesian approach. And you could think of it as randomized probability matching. So the idea is we don't assign people 50-50. We weight randomization. And in fact, Thompson sampling computes what's the probability that this explanation is the highest rated, based on the data we've seen so far. So the idea is that we're randomizing in proportion to how much evidence we have that something is the best. And this naturally allows you to phase in over time. So this again requires making assumptions about the model, which I'll just share and some people can skip. But basically, we model the probability of an explanation being good using a beta distribution. And we use beta 19 and 1, where the priors basically indicate very optimistic expectation that explanation is good, but again, not a strong one, so that the data is actually played a major role. And then the likelihood function is a binomial, where there are 10 draws, and the success parameter is drawn from that beta distribution. So intuitively, you can think of this as, if we give someone an explanation, they rate it an 8. It's as if they said, I want to give it 8 thumbs up and 2 thumbs down. And so that again gives us some evidence that this explanation is higher rated than another. And we're using conjugate distribution, so this is pretty efficient. It can just even run in a browser, in Chrome. And so every time someone gets an explanation and gives a rating, we're using Bayesian inference to update our model estimates of what are actually highly rated explanations. So to give you a sense of, I'll just skim through this. So basically, bandit is what I'm talking about here. Contextual bandit is a key goal for the future, where you see what works for different subgroups of people. And the way this fits in with things like MDPs or Markov decision processes is that they often assume repeated action on the same person. Here, we're kind of just thinking about how to generalize across people. And some more details about our model and how we use this algorithm. So in this deployment, we basically deploy this with just 150 people to make sure that these methods would work with the sample sizes we often have access to. So at the beginning, students don't get any explanation. But after a while, when they're explaining why an answer is correct, we keep adding to the pool. And so eventually there are a couple explanations that are assigned equally. But then as students are rating it, we start getting evidence that maybe there's a higher chance that this explanation is higher rated. So we're updating this distribution as we keep getting ratings in real time. So you're kind of trading off. Things that look good are being presented more frequently, but we're not stopping the experiment. We keep getting more data. So what you end up with is the policy. You have a probability distribution over explanations. So can you kind of see what would this look like, let's say after 150 people? Well, it doesn't look like this. This actually isn't very computationally efficient. And I don't think a system would work if we needed to just choose one best. In fact, what you find is that there are a few that have high probability, like 18%, and a few that are low rated that get deprecated. And so, hopefully this is actually identifying higher rated explanations. But what we really want to know is, does this actually impact people's behavior? So we then did a separate study where we tried to see, well, how do these explanations actually help students learn? And how do they compare to what an instructor comes up with? So in the separate study with another 600 people, we give everyone a test where they get a bunch of problems. Then we give them our study conditions, and then give them post-tests. So we actually want to see what's the effect of giving these explanations in terms of increasing their ability to solve problems. So in the control condition, we just give them the original problems. They just get problems with no explanations. In our condition, we give them problems, but now they have access to the explanations that came from our system. So this is the probability distribution of explanations. So they're getting the higher rated ones more. So comparing these, we can see what's actually helping learning. We also included a condition where we had explanations that were filtered out, so they got low probability from our system. And as a gold standard, explanations written by the actual instructor. So here's the actual data. So on the vertical axis, we're showing you, now before people got anything, how did they do on a test, solving some problems. Then after they got everything, we give them another test. So what you're seeing is the accuracy increase from pre to post. How much did each of these conditions actually increase their learning? So what you can see is doing some problems does push their learning a bit. But what about when we give them the access explanations? So what you're seeing here is that even though these are just crowdsourced from learners, once we run through this Thompson sampling algorithm, we are getting explanations that aren't just higher rated, they actually increase students' learning. So we can see it's moving the needle, it's having impact. If you're skeptical, you could say, well, of course, any explanation would help, right? It's something versus nothing. So what you can see is that's not actually true, because explanations that our system gave low probability, because they weren't highly rated, those are like getting no explanation at all. And so finally, let's look at how this compares to the instructor's explanations. How good would these have to be for you to think the system is useful? Like half as good as instructor, a quarter as good? Actually, there isn't a significant difference. So this system produces explanations that help learning just as much as an expert instructor who spent a lot of time developing them. And you can imagine settings in health where maybe what participants suggest will be better than what doctors suggest. Maybe the settings where what people suggest is not as good as what doctors do. So I think this is a really nice space to play around in. And the instructor actually found these explanations were comparable to theirs. So what are the key contributions of this work? So we kind of showed how you could actually get users to help us in crowdsourcing new experimental conditions. And they did it in a self-interested way. They weren't necessarily doing it because we paid them. It's because it was part of their natural activity. And also, here's how you use dynamic experimentation to put data into practice. So you might think now, how would we actually apply this approach to settings like health? Whether it's messages for people to exercise, or the questions people want to be asked to help them reflect on their emotional or mental health. I'll just give one other example, this pushing towards personalization. So in this setting, we wanted to actually send people emails in a course where we varied features of the emails, like the intro message, like whether it was brief or it mentioned that they hadn't been active in a while on their platform. And so I'm just jumping straight in. What we can see is like which of these messages led to higher response rate to emails. This is getting people to respond about a course, but you could apply this to getting people to exercise or eat healthy. Well, it looks at first like there's no difference. So should you just give up and go home? This was a waste of time, right? But actually, once you start building profiles of people, if you break it up by who was low activity and high activity, here's what you find. In fact, which message worked varied based on whether someone was not very active or whether they were high activity. So for example, the mention absence message might have been better because people who had been absent wanted to justify why recently they'd stopped coming. Whereas the brief message worked maybe for low activity people because they were just more likely to read something short. when we actually did analysis, if you personalized, which is to say you send a separate group of people, low activity people got the brief message and high got the mention absence, then you can increase response rates by about 14%. So you can actually optimize by personalizing. We're not adding new conditions, we're just figuring out who to route them to. So this is an example of how you can use experimentation to discover how to personalize and then dynamically deploy that. I think this is a huge direction of future research because everyone talks about personalization. But when you actually experimentally try to measure what makes a difference, then life gets a lot harder. So if we can deploy these systems, we can have a hope of actually showing things that have real impact on users. Great, so just to review what I covered. I started with this vision of how do we actually take pieces of technology and make them like intelligent systems that are always improving. Just like how, a health coach is always trying to help people do better and better. So my approach I suggested was let's think about how we can reimagine randomized A/B experiments to be collaborative between designers and users and psychologists, to be dynamic because we can analyze data in real time and deploy it, and also personalized, where we can give different conditions to different people. And so I gave one example in education of how we could crowdsource explanations from users and then use machine learning to figure out which ones were highly rated. And these help learning just as much as explanations from a real instructor. A quick example of how we can apply experimentation to personalize, where we can design conditions to target different subgroups and then actually get evidence that some emails work better for different subgroups of people, like based on the activity level. And that can actually lead to optimization and personalizing, where with these same messages, we just figure out how to deliver them better to people. And again, what I'm really excited about and working on now, about a third of my research, is how do we apply these approaches to help behavior change? Because I've done work before on building technology to help people deal with depression by giving them exercises where they try to apply cognitive behavior therapy to their everyday life, like noticing their emotions, revising how they think, and spotting errors. But I haven't actually applied this dynamic experimentation approach there. So we could do that with NUS students, with people from the general population. Another area there is thinking of how do we use those psychological principles to get people to exercise more. For example, what messages we send or when we send them. And a key thing there will actually be letting users tell us, here's what I want you to tell me. So they're going to feel like they're personalizing their app because they're telling you what they want to hear, and it may have an effect. But again, they're basically feeding into the system because every suggestion they make might work on someone else. And I think this would also work well in settings like how do you help people eat healthier, which is a combination of education about nutrition, but also behavior change, like resisting impulses. And in general, I think anything that's around behavior change, online diabetes, I'm especially interested in. And I'm sure you all have great ideas for other settings I should look at, so look forward to hearing more.
Explanation seems to suggest that the quality of explanation is not that important. So I guess naturally is probably task oriented, because I think for a fact-based task, then probably quality is important, and maybe the leisure activity, probably explanation is not so important. Then maybe I just ask a related question, is how to evaluate the quality of explanation, that kind of thing, which is an important issue that was brought up in some of my work. Yeah, so maybe I'd hear your view about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When does the quality of explanations matter or not? Because we did find some cases where it did matter and others where it didn't. So I think one thing you can do is always collect people's subjective judgments. For example, asking people to rate. But one thing I found is that the way you ask a question makes a big difference. So, for example, you could say, how do you like this explanation on a scale from 0 to 10? Versus, how helpful was this information for your learning on a scale from 0 to 10? Now, I know most of you were like, I just said the same thing twice. Actually, those two have pretty profound differences in actually which of those metrics lead to better explanations. So I definitely do some, user-centered design and using ideas from psychology about how you design assessment. But that's one way I try and do it, is crafting it so it elicits just the right judgment, because it can make a really big difference in actually whether we get a good measure of quality. So a lot of design the assessment question right and then validating it. So we tested it out and see, well, actually people's response to this question, they don't really tell us much, but these do. Another key thing is actually, how do we tie those short-term measures, like getting people to say, how helpful was this tip for your behavior, with actually whether they exercise the day after. So we actually try and look for both objective measures of behavior, like whether they exercise more, as well as more intermediate measures, like getting a rating or actually giving them a scenario. So that's what a lot of the psychology part comes in is, ideally you just see if they behave differently, but that can take a month to get. So what I try to do is come up with intermediate measures that can kind of simulate what it's like out in the real world, and we validate those. But that makes a big difference, because I think that's the tough thing, is knowing what's actually going to impact behavior.
Okay. Okay, so let's thank Yusuf again for the wonderful discussion and talk. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.